Ready to get started, I think. Welcome everybody to the version 2 launch party for the Black Book. It was about a year ago that we launched the beta of the Game Master tools, thinking that by the end of September we would be live with it. But it took a little longer than that. We learned a ton. For people who are here, aren't quite sure what the Black Book is. The Black Book is the official set of digital tools for the Gumshoe line of role-playing games for Pelgrane Press. If you don't know what Gumshoe is, it's a series of investigative role-playing games that focus on running investigations and making the sort of procedural investigations very sort of easy and intuitive. Northland Creative Wonders is very pleased to be able to produce the digital tools to support both players and game masters in that. We've gotten a lot of feedback. We put a lot of work into this, and we are very excited to be launching version 2 tonight. I won't speak any longer. Do we want to show a quick trailer, and then we will hop into the Lovecraft content that is primed to our celebration tonight.
Okay. Can everybody see the black screen?
Yep.
Wonderful.
That looks really cool.
Thank you. All right, so that is the trailer for the new Black Book tools. So without further ado, we will turn ourselves over to the Rhode Island Historical Society for an amazing presentation that they have put together for us. I would like to welcome and introduce Catherine Hurst from the Rhode Island Historical Society for our feature presentation about H.P. Lovecraft and the city in which he lived and wrote. Catherine is a retired marketing executive and college professor and has devoted much of her time in recent years to historical research, writing, performance, and tourism. So I will stop sharing so that Catherine can share her screen with you.
Okay. Let's get this up here. Okay, so can everybody see that?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. And can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Just checking. So thank you, Amber, and hi, everybody. My name is Kathy Hurst, as Amber said, and I'm a walking tour guide with the Rhode Island Historical Society, and this is a tour of Lovecraft's Providence. And I'm particularly interested in the use of Providence, and Providence is actually the city where I live, because it was not only the setting for Lovecraft's work, the place where a number of his stories were set, but I also feel as if the sort of historic and slightly decrepit situation that Providence was in the 1920s and the 1930s really imbued his other stories as well. So in this tour, we'll look at places where Lovecraft lived, places where his characters lived, and other places that are associated with Lovecraft, places where he hung out or there's some other Lovecraftian significance. Stories, which, as I'm sure you know, Haunter of the Dark, the Case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Call of Cthulhu, and the Shunned House. And as you know, Lovecraft was born in Providence in 1890 and died here in 1937. He spent all of his life here except for 2 years in New York after his marriage and a few short vacations. And the provenance of his stories is from the 1920s and 1930s, and most of it is still here today in the city, but generally it's in much better condition than it was in Lovecraft's time. The total route of this tour is about 1.5 miles, and I hope you got a copy of the route map so that you can follow along. If you didn't, I'm just going to briefly get it up on the screen for you here. And we're going to be starting down here on Benefit Street at site number 1. We'll move up College Hill towards Brown University, up Prospect Street. Then we'll loop around here and come up to Prospect Street again. See a couple of sites here, down the hill back to Benefit Street and back to the start. This is the reason I wanted to show you this map is because I feel as if you should know how close everything is to each other, that Lovecraft could have, and in fact did, of his that we will look at on the tour, one of which is here at spot number 3, and the other one down here at spot number 10. So let's get started. Oh, and if you have any questions during the tour, if you could just type them into the chat, and then Amber at the end will handle the questions in whatever time we have to go through them. So I'm going to start here with the Stephen Hopkins house, and this is site number 1 on the map. And Stephen Hopkins acquired this house, which had been built in 1707, this little back part of the house with the skylight, and he added on the front part of the house in 1743. And Hopkins was one of Rhode Island's signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was also descended from its original settlers, and he was a 10-term governor of Rhode Island, among other accomplishments. He was also Howard P. Lovecraft's second cousin 5 times removed, so there's even a family connection there. So the house would originally have been located along the river at the bottom. This is the house where Stephen Hopkins and the Brown brothers, who gave their name to Brown University, and several other dignitaries from Providence met in 1770 to decide what they were going to do about Joseph Curwen in the case of Charles Dexter Ward. So this house at the time would have been located on the river. It's actually been moved twice to its present location. And here's another view of the house from the front, and you can see how steep this hill is. Lovecraft often talks about the hill, College Hill. He talks about it as precipitous, as vertical. He uses quite a lot of adjectives to give us his opinion of how steep it was. And I'm sure he walked up and down it numerous times, so he probably was well aware of the steepness. Now we're going to walk across the street and walk down just a few buildings to get to the Providence Athenaeum. And this is a library, a membership library that was built in 1838, and it was frequented by Edgar Allan Poe, who courted Sarah Helen Whitman, his fiancée, for a few months in this library. And it was just down the street from Lovecraft's house, and the fact that it was so close to where he lived, plus the fact that Edgar Allan Poe and Mrs. Whitman hung out here, made it a really attractive spot for him. And he mentions this library in the Shunned House. He also mentions it in the case of Charles Dexter Ward because he has Charles doing some research here, as Lovecraft would have himself done research. And he writes about the Athenaeum and Poe in a letter in 1924. And he says, Providence, which spurned Eddie living, now reveres him dead and treasures every memory connected with him. And among the things he mentions are the Athenaeum, where he used to dream and ramble through the corridors. So he was very conscious of the connection to Poe. I wanted to just spend a minute on this fountain right here in the front of the library, and we'll zoom in on that. And the thing that I love about this fountain is around the, just under the arch, come hither everyone that thirsteth. So whether you were thirsting physically, you could get a drink in the fountain, or your horse could get a drink in the trough down here, or whether your thirst was metaphorical, you could come to the library and quench that thirst as well. And I imagine that Lovecraft quenched both his physical and metaphorical thirsts in this fountain. Inside the library, there's actually a bust of Lovecraft that was presented to the library in 2013 at the time of the first modern Necronomicon, which is a big Lovecraft conference held in Providence every year. And I'm not sure, Steve, would your folks be familiar with that, with Necronomicon? It's certainly a huge convention, conference, celebration of all things Lovecraft. And the next one, I believe, will be in 2020. There's also another sculpture of Lovecraft underway. This has been made by Providence sculptor Gage Prentice, and he's created this life-size bronze sculpture of Lovecraft that he hopes will find a home in the downtown part of the city. They're looking at several possible sites. And this image is from Gage's backyard. The caption he posted for this is, "As current steward of the Providence Lovecraft statue, it has occurred to me that I have the best Halloween yard decoration in all of Rhode Island." So I love that caption. Now we're going to head around the corner and up College Hill to the site where Lovecraft's final home was located. And people joke about Providence. They say people in Rhode Island always give directions by saying this is where such and such used to be. So this is where Lovecraft's house used to be. And we will actually see the house a little bit later because it was moved around the corner. So it's still here, just in a different place. And this is the place that he would have lived from 1933 until 1937 when he died. And it's now Brown University Art Center. And you can see the columns of the Art Center on the first picture on the left-hand side. And that photograph is taken from the street side looking towards the back of the lot. The picture on the right is taken from the back of the lot looking towards the street. And Lovecraft lived in this house with his Aunt Annie. And he had a bedroom and study on the second floor, and Annie had the rest of the apartment. And he wrote Haunter of the Dark here. And in that story, he gives Robert Blake, the protagonist, the same rooms that he himself had in this house. And he was very much about setting his stories in Providence in locations that he lived in or spent time in. And he describes it as it being a cozy and fascinating place in a little garden oasis where huge friendly cats sunned themselves atop a convenient shed. And you can see the little garden oasis is still there, even though the house isn't. And now we'll go next door and see the second library where Lovecraft liked to spend time. And this is the John Hay Library. This was built in 1910. And it's named for a Brown graduate who was secretary to Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State under Presidents McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. And at Lovecraft's day, this would have been the General Brown University Library. Today, it's only the Archives Library, and there is a huge H.P. Lovecraft collection there that people can go in and use to do research with. There are more than 1,000 books and magazines containing material by or about Lovecraft, plus 2,000 original letters and manuscripts of his essays, fiction, and poetry. It's said that he wrote 100,000 letters in his lifetime, which is a pretty amazing quantity. And of course, those were not like little email messages. They were often multi-page handwritten letters. So he must have spent quite a bit of time in his correspondence. And before we leave this corner, which is site number 4 on the map, I want to point out the Van Wickle entrance to the Brown campus, which is directly across the street, and show you a photograph of Lovecraft there. So you can see he's sitting on that bench. And as I say, the sites that he spent time in are still here. If I were cleverer with film, I would have overlaid the black and white Lovecraft on the color photograph that I took, but you'll have to live with them side by side here. And now we're going to go back to the Hay Library, go just past it, so you can see we're now on the right-hand side from what we would have seen in the original photograph. And there's a little monument on the side of the property right down here, and we're going to zoom in on that. And that's a monument to Lovecraft on this property. And this is a poem from the Fungi of Yuggoth. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he talks about the architecture in Providence in this poem. And in the second verse, he says, "Streets with carved doorways where the sunset beams flooded old fan lights and small window panes. and Georgian steeples topped with gilded vanes. These are the sights that shaped my childhood dreams. And you'll see a little bit later when we get to his house that it has the fan light, the small window panes. And we'll also see a Georgian steeple that he was very impressed by. So those elements are sort of all around us here. Now, just a couple of blocks down the street is another Lovecraft memorial. This is H.P. Lovecraft Memorial Square. And this is site number 7 on the map. And at this intersection of Angel and Prospect Streets, this really would have been the center of Lovecraft's universe. Angel Street was the street he grew up on, 2 houses, one of which is no longer there that we won't see on this tour. But about 3/4 of a mile down the street from here is one of his childhood homes, and another 1/4 of a mile beyond that is a second. And this plaque was also placed and the square named at the time of the first Necronomicon in 2013. Now we're going to walk to 65 Prospect Street, where the Lovecraft house was moved in 1959. So this is the house that would have been on that grassy lot that we saw earlier, where the Brown University Art Center is now. Lovecraft says he was really happy living in this house. In a way, it was the house he always wanted to live in. He wasn't a big fan of Victorian architecture. He really liked the colonial period architecture, and this beautiful federal house was something that he would have aspired to live in, something like this. And as I mentioned earlier, he describes it in Haunter of the Dark. You can get a full description of this house in that story. And there's a great story about Lovecraft and his aunt who shared this space. He lived on the 2nd floor in the front. She lived in the back, and they shared a kitchen. And when Howard used to wash the dishes, he would wash, dry, and put away one dish at a time. I'm sure that sounds very Lovecraftian to you, and I'm sure it drove his aunt crazy. So this is another view of that house, just turned slightly so that you see the house on the right-hand side. And next to it, just across the street, is the Christian Science Church. And this was another property that Lovecraft loved. Of course, he didn't live next door to it the way the house is here now. But that quote that's on the screen, the vast gleaming dome and sunset-flushed ionic columns of the Christian Science Church beckoned me northward. This is again from the case of Charles Dexter Ward. And even though it isn't sunset flushed, you can see that he would have loved this beautiful piece of architecture in Providence. All right, so now we're going down the street a couple of blocks and to site, let's see, make sure I get my sites up here, 16. So this is so-called Prospect Park or Prospect Terrace, he sometimes refers to it as. And it's included here for 2 reasons. The first of which is that he used it as a setting, Lovecraft. And secondly, he liked to sit here. He liked to sit on this bench, look out over the city, and he used to bring along a knapsack with him with his books and papers and pencils, and he would write here often because he was inspired by the view. And he talks about the view quite a bit, and he talks about it in Charles Dexter Ward. And he says there, he had been wheeled along sleepy Condon Street, 1 tier lower down the steep hill. The nurse used to stop and sit on the benches of Prospect Terrace to chat with policemen. The vast marble dome of the State House stood out in massive silhouette. So there's the State House. There's actually a pretty good view of Providence from further down the park, but this is the view that he talks about in Charles Dexter Ward. And the trees have gotten quite a bit bigger than they were in Lovecraft's time. So the State House is gradually getting blocked out here. I'm not sure if anybody has a plan to deal with that. But Lovecraft liked to sit here. He was inspired by the view, and he really enjoyed this park. Now we're going to walk along to 10 Barnes Street, where Lovecraft lived in the 1920s. He came to Barnes after he moved back from New York after his failed marriage and before moving to the house that we just saw. And just here's one more view of that State House a little bit closer. So here's the Barnes Street house. And as you know, Lovecraft had moved with his wife to Brooklyn in 1924. And as I'm sure you know, the marriage didn't really work out. There's a quote from her where she describes him as a, quote, adequately excellent lover, unquote, which is sort of damning with faint praise there. But Lovecraft moved to Providence in April 1926, and he moved into this house with his aunt Lillian. And his apartment was on the 1st floor in the back. You can't really see that part of the house from this angle. And Lillian lived upstairs. And it was after Lillian died that he moved with Annie into that other house that we just saw, his Aunt Annie. And in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, this is the house where he has Dr. Marina Spignell Willett live. And if you look at the map, you can see how close it is to the house where he imagines that Charles Dexter Ward lived. And he wasn't especially fond of this house. As I said, he didn't care for Victorian architecture, but his creativity really exploded when he moved back here to Providence, I think partly just from being away from the city so long. He wrote The Call of Cthulhu here in 1926. He wrote The Case of Charles Dexter Ward in 1927, and a number of other works, a total of 6 pieces in the space of 12 months. So he was very productive. Now we're going to go see the house where he set Charles Dexter Ward, which is just around the corner. And this is that house, and this is called the Halsey House. It's a federal mansion. It was built in 1801 by Colonel Thomas Halsey, who was a shipping merchant who had amassed a large fortune. And by Lovecraft's time, it was reputed to be haunted. And I'm sure Lovecraft contributed to that by his writing. And he sets the Charles Dexter Ward home here. It's actually numbered 140 Prospect Street, but in the story, he calls it 100 Prospect. But it's clearly the house. He was clearly trying to protect the residents here. And he describes it early in the story as follows. His home was a great Georgian mansion atop the well-nigh precipitous hill, another adjective to describe that hill, that rises just east of the river. Here he was born, and from the lovely classic porch of the double-bayed brick facade, his nurse had first wheeled him in his carriage. And the person who was living in this house at the time of Lovecraft's writing of the story was a man by the name of William Lippitt Moran, actually a young man. He was a sickly teenager. And his nurse used to wheel him around in his wheelchair. And it's believed that Lovecraft gives the vision of Charles Dexter Ward being wheeled around by his nurse and the things he observes from his wheeled perch to seeing William Lippitt Moran being wheeled around the neighborhood, because of course Lovecraft only lived a block or 2 away. And this, by the way, is site 11 on your map. And the date that Charles came home from Europe in the story was May 1926, which is essentially the same point at which Lovecraft came back from New York. So he could also describe the city the way he does in that story, the way someone returning from a long journey or from some time away does when they see their home with fresh eyes, as Charles did and as Lovecraft would have done. Now we're going to go down that precipitous hill to Benefit Street and look at another couple of properties there. And I actually tried, I was going to put a little video in here and try to show you how steep this hill was. And I started walking down the hill and shooting the video on my camera phone and realized that I wasn't going to be able to walk down the hill, keep my balance, and take the picture at the same time. So you'll have to live with other shots of the hill from other angles. But I've included this corner here because in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, again, he talks about this intersection. And he says, farther and farther down that almost perpendicular hill he would venture, each time reaching older and quainter levels of the ancient city. He would hesitate down vertical Jenks Street to the shady Benefit Street corner. And this Jenks Street is the street that you see running sort of from behind where we're standing looking at this down to the street that runs parallel to the house in front of us. And the cross street is Benefit Street. Before him was a wooden antique with an ionic pilastered pair of doorways. That's that house with the orange doors. And beside him, a prehistoric gambrel roofer. If you're not familiar with gambrel roofs, they're roofs that have, instead of going straight up like this, they go up part way and then make that second point to the top. And these are both 18th century houses here on this corner. And you can see how steep this hill is because you see that set of granite stones that have been put in place in front of that house. And that's because that house had been hit several times by people who were unable to stop heading down the hill. So they've protected themselves with that row of stones. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that Lovecraft was super familiar with architectural elements and terminology. He describes these columns, for example, as ionic pilastered, those sort of built-in columns around the doorways. And I don't know about you, but I studied Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian columns in grammar school, and I still couldn't tell you the difference among them. But Lovecraft had a real good grasp of those architectural elements. Now we're going to turn left on Benefit Street and walk along to the churchyard of St. John's Episcopal Church. which is another one of Lovecraft's favorite places to hang out, and also a place where Edgar Allan Poe used to spend time. So let me just get that slide up. So on the first page of the Shunned House, Lovecraft writes, Edgar Allan Poe used to sojourn often on Benefit Street during his unsuccessful wooing of the gifted poetess, Mrs. Whitman. His favorite walk led northward along the same street to Mrs. Whitman's home, and her house actually backs up to this churchyard just a little bit further down on the other side of the church. And the neighboring hillside churchyard of St. John's, whose hidden expanse of 18th century gravestones had for him a peculiar fascination. And in a 1937 letter, Lovecraft writes, Poe knew of this place and is said to have wandered among its whispering willows during his here 90 years ago. Last August, 2 guests, and we all sat down in the altar tomb and wrote rhymed acrostics on the name of Edgar Allan Poe. The altar tombs are the tombs with flat tops. If you can see my arrow here. Sorry. I'm pointing out an altar tomb right here. It's recently struck me that Lovecraft talks about Poe having lived in Providence 90 years before, and that's just about the same amount of time that exists between Lovecraft and our present time. So I want to share with you a poem that Lovecraft wrote about Poe, and I'm not going to read this to you, but if you look down the left-hand side, you see that the first letter of each line spells out Edgar Allan Poe. And the last 2 lines, he says, only the few who sorcery's secret know espy amidst these tombs the shade of Poe. And so he's basically saying here that that he feels like he appreciates Poe's presence in that graveyard, even if perhaps other people who see that graveyard do not. And now we're going to walk down Benefit Street to Sarah Helen Whitman's house, whose yard backs up to the churchyard. And this is the house. Remember I said earlier that most of the things that Lovecraft would have seen in his day are still in Providence, only they're in much better shape. And here's an example. This house, the Sarah Helen Whitman house, is in beautiful condition. You can see a Lovecraft standing in front of it down below, and it looks much more decrepit. Of course, it's a terrible snowy day and a bad quality photograph, so that doesn't help, but this is definitely the same house. This house was significant to Lovecraft because Sarah Helen Whitman was Poe's fiance, and so Poe would have spent time at this house, not so much in the house because Mrs. Whitman wasn't very fond of Poe, Sarah's mother, but they used to meet in the backyard and in the cemetery of the churchyard just behind the house. This is site number 14 on your map. So the next house on our tour is the house where Lovecraft's story, The Shunned House, is set, and it's just a couple of blocks down the street. And here it is. Of course, in the house, in the story, he describes this as a haunted, decrepit, kind of gray, forbidding house. And now it's this beautiful sunny yellow, which doesn't quite go with the Lovecraft mood. So I try to photograph it with some shadows and tree trunks here to give it a little bit of creepiness. But this house was built in 1763 by the Mauney family, and it was one of the first houses built on Benefit Street, and it's the oldest surviving house on Benefit. And Lovecraft's Aunt Lillian had lived in this house as a companion to a woman named Mrs. Babbitt. And so Lovecraft himself would have been in this house, would have spent some time here. And he was familiar with the location. And he was also familiar with the mythology that surrounded the house. And I want to talk about that briefly and just give you a little bit of detail. When Roger Williams, who was the original settler here, settled here in 1636, they settled along the river. And Williams believed in the separation of church and state. You know, most New England towns were built around a green with a church in the middle and a town hall or a meeting place, a tavern of some sort, and then a central place where people could gather, sometimes where grazing happened and where there might be a cemetery. And then the houses were built all around the circle, around the outside of that green. But in Providence, the houses were all built on parallel lots of everybody with riverfront property and heading up the hill. And they used to bury their dead along this flat ridge about halfway up their property. It was far enough away from the water supply that it was protected, and it was flat so the bodies wouldn't be dislodged by rain. And over time, it became quite filled with gravestones. And in 1750, when the city decided to widen the street and turn it into an actual street, because they needed more living space in the city, they moved the bodies to a graveyard called the North Burial Ground. But it's reasonable to believe that many bodies didn't get moved, bodies that weren't marked, bodies that were buried without the knowledge of other folks, or where people had forgotten that they were buried there, or even just bits or pieces of bone and debris that didn't get dug up when they moved the bodies. And so Lovecraft takes that link, the link of the actual history, and he combines it with some mythology about supposedly a French Huguenot couple who have been buried here, and he turns it into the story that's in the shunned house. And now we're going to walk a couple of blocks down the street and take a right turn heading downhill towards the river, and the last two sites that we're going to see on our tour today. And this is the First Baptist Church in Providence. This is site 16 on your map. And this was the Phillips family church, and it was a gloomy, crumbling spot in Lovecraft's day. It wasn't the pristine white. It actually is whiter than the left-hand photograph shows, but probably not quite as astonishingly white as the right-hand picture. The actual color is somewhere in between there. The picture on the left is the picture of the back of the church. The picture on the right is the front of the church. And again, you can get a feeling for how steep that hill is running down, because you see the first floor in the back of the church, and you see how high up that is by the time you get to the front of the church. And Lovecraft describes this church in a 1924 letter. He says, "The first objective of our trip was that supreme landmark of Providence, the First Baptist Church, finished in 1775. We found it as pleasing within as without, the paneling and the carving above the doors being especially notable as specimens of Georgian workmanship." So there he is with his architectural critiques again. And on the other side of the street is the Providence Art Club, and this building in particular, the Fleur-De-Lis studio that we're going to talk about. And before I flip to that slide, I just want you to notice, left-hand picture, you just see off to the right of the church this yellow three-story property here, and that's next door to the building that we're going to see. So that just gives you a feeling of where we're walking to now. All right, so this is the so-called Fleur-De-Lis House. This is part of the Providence Art Club. And the Providence Art Club was founded in 1880, and Lovecraft's mother and aunt were both members, and they were both painters. And his aunt had some paintings displayed in exhibitions at the art club. And this building was built in 1885 by Sidney Burley, who was a prominent artist of the time. And it was built as a workspace for himself and his artist friends. And it's still used as a studio space today as part of the Providence Art Club. And Lovecraft made this building the residence of his character, Henry Anthony Wilcox, in The Call of Cthulhu. And he describes the building you see here, the Fleur-De-Lis Building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Breton architecture, which flaunts its stuccoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses of the ancient hill and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. So you remember the finest Georgian steeple is here, and here's the flaunted stucco front. So you can tell he doesn't care for this architectural element here. And one of the elements featured in the story is a bas-relief, which is described by Lovecraft, bears some resemblance to a bas-relief on the building here. And we're going to look at, you can see there's these panels right under these small blue windows on the right-hand front of the house. And we're going to look close up at those. And you can see them here. And in the story, in The Call of Cthulhu, he describes the bas-relief that he's writing about. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. So I think you can see from these two bas-relief on the front of the building that he was really inspired by them when he wrote that description. I wanted to point out that he would have come here as a child with his aunt and his mother, and as a child he would have stood in front of those and they would have been eye level for him. if you're an adult walking by this, your head is up higher. You're not seeing these. They're kind of bent away underneath the building, and you have to work hard to look at them. But if you were a child, you would have been close up, and you can see that he must have been sort of frightened, awed, inspired by looking at those. And I couldn't do a Providence tour for you without including Lovecraft's grave, which is actually not on the walking tour that we do. It's a couple of miles further away. But he was actually buried under his parents' obelisk at the cemetery in 1937. But 40 years later, some Lovecraft fans raised money to give him a headstone of his own. And this photo I did not take. Swan Point Cemetery has a policy against taking photographs for commercial use. So I just cribbed somebody else's photograph from the internet. But this picture is typical in that it shows all the little items that Lovecraft fans leave by his grave. You can see shells and pencils. There's a little dinosaur figure on top of that, a little monster figure in the front, and so a little note. And I wanted to end the tour with the Lovecraft quote from which the statement here on the gravestone, "I am Providence," comes from. And this is from a letter he wrote to his Aunt Lillian in 1926 when he was coming back to Providence, about the significance of Providence in his life and in his writing. "My local affectations are not personal, but topographical and architectural. I'm always an outsider, but outsiders have their sentimental preferences. I will be dogmatic only to the extent of saying that it is New England I must have in some form or other. Providence is part of me, and I am Providence. Providence would always be at the back of my head as a goal to be worked toward, an ultimate paradise to be regained at last." So that's the end of my presentation. And now if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to take them. Amber, you can be able to manage these.
Yes, so we had, if anybody has any more questions, please write them down in the chat. We had 2 come through while you were talking. The first of which was, what is your take on modern updates to stories like BBC's Whisper in the Darkness podcast or the new Color Out of Space movie? Is the time period central to the story, or is the cosmic nihilism and location enough?
I think that's a really interesting question. I was quite fascinated with the BBC versions, especially the first one, which I felt was quite close to the story. They sort of seemed like they stepped further apart when they went into the second story because they linked it so tightly to the first story. But it seems to me that the sort of mysteriousness holds up even with making it more contemporary. I thought they did a really masterful job.
Awesome. The second question was, obviously Lovecraft was a controversial individual and is known for some tendencies of his that were discriminatory. Adding to that his love for the weird and macabre, what is the perspective of the citizenry of Providence towards Lovecraft? Do most people in Providence know about him and his contributions to literature, or is it more niche? Has anyone defaced any of these historic locations throughout history, not related to the current protests?
Wow, that's a multi-part, subcategory A, B, C type question, isn't it? I think that that certainly. Well, and Jen, from the Historical Society, you may be able to comment further on this, on the case of what generally people of Providence think, because you're probably exposed to more folks who are interested in Lovecraft than I am. But we try on our walking tours to talk about Lovecraft's racism, and we have to deal at the Historical Society with several uncomfortable topics, including the fact that the house where the society is based probably employed slaves, and that the Brown family were involved in the slave trade in Providence. And so that's something that that we've all had to come to terms with and figure out a way to talk about. And we talk about Lovecraft in that regard as somebody who, had ideas that were probably fairly typical of the men of his time and in his milieu. The people, there were other men who lived on the east side of Providence who would have felt much the same way, but because Lovecraft wrote down all of his thoughts, it comes back to haunt him all these years later. This is why, your mother tells you that you shouldn't post stuff on Facebook that you don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper. But I think that, certainly most people that I know in Providence tend to know who Lovecraft is, and I'm not aware of any any.
Oh, you cut out for a minute there.
I cut out?
Yeah.
Okay. I just, I guess I wanted to say at the time at the Necronomicon, certainly people seem to treat everyone who comes to the Necronomicon well and to be happy about that presence of Lovecraft in our lives. And I was curious, Jen, if you knew if there had been any either defacings of Lovecraft sites or any kind of rumbling feedbacks from people in Providence about Lovecraft's racist tendencies.
Yeah, I think they're, so hi everybody, I work with the Historical Society. So to follow up on that, I think that there is a general conversation, a general discourse that's happening about Lovecraft as deeply linked to Providence and Providence history. He's a controversial figure, and it's something that we're, as a city, I think, trying to grapple with. I believe that's actually one of the reasons why currently Gage Prentice's statue is in his backyard. There's a conversation about, like, well, where does that go, and how do we honor this figure who made major contributions to literature, but holds these personal opinions that are difficult to reconcile with in 2020. The sites, specifically the ones that Kathy talked about today, I mean, we're looking at them in the light of Lovecraft, but they're also historic sites beyond just him. So I don't think they're really, not to my understanding or to my knowledge, that they've been defaced because they're connected to him. They predate him in many cases, and they're still historic, and they tell multiple stories over time. So it's not that they're just Lovecraftian sites, other than his grave site, but that, as you can see, has more reverence around it.
So we got one more question, I believe. On Lovecraft Country and the Ballad of Black Tom, does directly advertising the unsavory elements of Lovecraft's views while keeping the mythology reconcile today's views with the great fictive elements of the mythos?
I'm not sure I understand that question well enough to comment. Jen, how about you?
Nope, I was thinking the same thing. I apologize.
Sorry about that. My expertise is not in Lovecraft per se, it's in Providence. And so, it's, you know, I'm certainly familiar with the Providence stories, less familiar with other parts of his work. So, and less familiar with other kind of maybe more contemporary things around Lovecraft. So, any other questions or thoughts? I noticed there were some very nice comments that came up. So thank you for the thank yous. You know, we had fun doing it. Jennifer.
Oh, I think you cut out on my end, Kathy.
Yeah, mine as well.
Oh no, Kathy.
Okay.
Oh, you're back.
No, there's a, my internet provider is operating, they say, at 105% of capacity. So
Yes.
sometimes I get these little blips, but I hope we made it through most of the tour without losing too much.
Okay, so we did get one more. Didn't Lovecraft's controversial opinion change later in his life?
Yeah, I believe it did. I mean, he died when he was 46. So it would be interesting to see what his opinion might have been if he had lived into the 1960s, you know, I mean, which is certainly would have been a reasonable time frame for him to have lived to. I think that there's sort of a few things that when we talk about Lovecraft racism on the tour, we say, you know, partly he adopted the racist ideas out of a need to feel superior because his own world had been so destroyed early on. I mean, his father had died, his grandfather had died, his parents both were mentally ill, his grandfather lost all his money, his marriage failed, he was poor. I mean, he had a lot of strikes against him. And he blamed it kind of on the general other, which to him, you know, was pretty much anybody who wasn't a white, descendant of the early settlers of Rhode Island. But he definitely did become less racist as he aged. And by the end of his life, if he had lived longer, he might not have been racist at all. I like to think that he would have learned.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm going to tack onto that as well. I find it interesting to consider what his views would have been if he had lived and seen what had happened in World War II. We think a lot about, he dies right before that happens, and easily like right before the US's involvement of it. So many ideas changed and shifted from when he passes away in the late 30s in a decade later. The world changes, as we know. So I think he was in a period of shifting, and I think everybody's views shifted so much more, especially in seeing how eugenics and the Holocaust would have affected multiple cultures.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think also, it's if we think again about the time period in which he lived in Providence, the Ku Klux Klan was very active in Rhode Island. There are things that we don't sort of know about that period, and we've used kind of today's lens to look back at the past. So, yeah, I think the war, would have had a big effect on him.
Wow, interesting takes. All right, so we did get one more question, and I believe this is the last one at the moment. If you were to write a horror story, Kathy and Jen, what would inspire you outside of what you showed us about Providence?
Ooh.
As a horror story, I don't tend to be a horror kind of person, so I tend to sort of see everything with a pretty bright light. But there's certainly probably a lot of pretty horrible COVID-19 things that we could write about. We could probably create a pretty good horror story around that. Although things are pretty positive in Providence right at the moment. Don't want to over promise, but we're looking good here in New England. So, but I guess that would be where I would head.
I can respect that. I think if I were to write a horror story, so this is not anything that Kathy mentioned on the tour. It's a Providence story, and it's a Providence couple related to the family that's linked to Brown University. There's a woman named Anne Mary Brown, and she passed away fairly young, and her husband built a memorial for her that's right around the corner from the John Brown house. And this memorial, it's 3 different rooms. It's kind of a library museum, and both of them are actually buried together in the back space. And to me, that's, as one that reads a lot of actually Gothic literature, it's a very beautiful space, but it's also a very haunting space. In the building of the memorial, there were directions that roses were to be laid on their graves, I believe on Anne Mary's birthday, and that they were supposed to be left there to dry and then swept out the year later. So I would probably write a story around them in this situation, and in this beautiful building.
They still do that. I did actually go in there to check it out once. I went in there on the last day with the dead flowers, the 354-year-old day-old flowers, and then I went back the next day to see the new flowers. I was pretty amazed.
Yeah, I used to hold events there, and it would always surprise people because we would hold a lecture in the room right before the memorial space and right before their grave space, their grave site, and people would just kind of poke their head and be like, wait, what is happening here? I don't understand this building that I'm now in. So it creeps up on you. Almost.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everybody who has asked questions, and thank you Kathy and Jen for presenting.
Oh, my pleasure.
If you want to stick around, we will do the launch of version 2 of the Black Book before we get to our 2 giveaways to people that are sticking around. Sure. So let me share my screen so that you guys can get the full view of the brand new Black Book. Here it is. All right. All right. So the launch should be happening any moment now.
Want to refresh your browser? There we go. Black Book 2 is live.
Amazing. So this is the new site, as you have seen it. The new pricing scale for Game Master tools, player tools, and creative tools. If you check out our Facebook and Twitter in the next couple of days, we will be doing one more Game Master Tools free subscription giveaway, along with the 2 that will be happening right now.
Amber, can you click on the links next to the pictures and I'll give a quick snippet of what's in version 2?
Sure.
Yep. Wah, wah, live demo. Oh, that's disappointing. Go back to many supported games. Anyway, in the new version of the Black Book, we have the digital character sheets that we have had all along now. We've improved mobile device support for players, real-time GM matrix so that as a game master, you can see what your players are, where their various ability pools are during the game. And upon much request, we've added Discord integration. We do not have Slack quite yet. So you can see the results of character spends and get information about the status and descriptions and character portraits in Discord. We're super excited. We can't wait to see what you do with it. And please give us any and all feedback that you have on the new tools. Amber, I think we're ready for a giveaway.
All right. So after lots of hard work, and thank you so much to Jennifer and Kathy for being here and spending so much time taking pictures of everything and putting this whole event together. We would like to give away a tablet, a Samsung Tab A, and we have 2 Dungeons boxes that are essentially, it's a prop for your new tablet that you're going to get, the person that gets the tablet. And you can hold dice and things like that to play in person. So the first person, this is a random draw based on the people that have signed up and are here today, which is like a random generation. So our first person who is winning a Dungeons box and a free subscription is Lynn C-H. You still here? Yep, so if you could private message just me with an address that you want this sent to and an email, then we can get that sent to you. Thank you so much for coming. And for the big first prize, we have another Ebony Dungeons box and a Samsung Galaxy Tab A. Will be going to Timothy Judd. He/him/his is the name on our Zoom link. So again, if you could private message me where you want these sent. Thank you guys so much for participating. Again, keep an eye out on Facebook and our Twitter page for the final giveaway after Gen Con. It's going to be a post and tell us what your favorite event or favorite line or funniest thing that happened during Gen Con. Yeah, so thank you guys all for coming. We hope you guys enjoyed the Black Book, and we hope you guys loved the presentation by Jennifer and Kathy. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. The presentation was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'm so honored to receive that gift. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so we will send those out. And you should
I sent you a private message as well.
Okay, yes, I do see. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the presenters. It's great. Oh, I think they've already left. Anyways, thank you for doing this, Amber.
Yeah, thank you for coming. We really appreciate everybody being here.
Awesome. Take care.
Thank you, Amber. I
you.
appreciate it.